All I'm going to be calling for in the next few minutes is a radical reinvention of NASA. We know it's not easy, but who is doing this call? About 10 years ago, I was hustled to one of these ISDCs, my very first one, by a senior risk analyst from NASA, by somebody at the National Science Foundation, by a bunch of people from a lot of well-established organizations who somehow convinced me to go to an ISDC. And at the ISDC, I met Buzz Aldrin. And Buzz Aldrin said, we've got an election coming up in 2 years, we've got to get space on the presidential agenda, we need somebody to do this, and he kidnapped me into founding a group, the Space Development Steering Committee, which I've been running for the last 10 years, possibly 11 years. It is the Space Development Steering Committee that recommends this radical reinvention of NASA. By the way, the Space Development Steering Committee has included Edgar Mitchell, people from the National Science Foundation, people from NASA, etc. What is it that we're calling for? We're asking NASA to get out of the rocket business. Once upon a time, rockets were so expensive that only major governments could afford them. Then they came down in price. And slightly smaller, but still huge governments could then afford them. India, for example, which when I entered the space scene 10 years ago already had 70 satellites in orbit and recently put 104 satellites in orbit with one rocket. So India's in that business now. NASA is trying to build a rocket that's too expensive to fly. It's the Space Launch System. It's a real villain. It swallows $3 billion a year. When it finally flies, if it ever flies, it will cost between $1 billion and $2 billion to launch. That is the price of approximately 30 launches of a SpaceX Falcon. At today's SpaceX Falcon prices, and SpaceX Falcon prices, because of reusability, are about to drop dramatically. We are calling for NASA to get out of the rocket business. What it's doing is swallowing money for no earthly purpose. We're asking it to buy its rockets from SpaceX and from Jeff Bezos, who's also turning the corner in the reusability revolution right now. Well, manned space is all about big dreams, big goals, big missions, and the biggest mission is Mars. The next on the list is the moon, which we're talking about here. So if you're going to take NASA out of the rocket business, how are you going to get to Mars and the moon? Very simple. There is only one person on the face of planet Earth with a practical program for Mars. His name is Elon Musk, and that practical program is coming out of private industry. It's not coming out of NASA. So there is allegedly a NASA plan to get us to Mars. There are only a few small problems. It's not doable, it's not affordable, it's all a crock. It is based on the idea that we will take the Space Launch System at $2 billion a launch and put up between 12 and 30 launches of the Space Launch System. It is all based on the idea that we will carry our astronauts to Mars in a little tiny 1955 to 1965 technology capsule called the Orion. Okay, let's imagine we spend that $2 billion for each of these 30 launches, and we put up Orion capsules with astronauts in them, nice American astronauts of both sexes, and possibly somebody bi or translaterally genitalic, God knows, or what. But one way or the other, once we get these people in this tiny tin can into orbit, are they going to be able to spend the next 6 months of their lives in that teensy little tin can going to Mars? Well, no, not really. Okay. Then, once we get them to Mars, how are they going to land? Wait, how are they going to land? I thought you said you had a Mars program. I thought you had a way to land it. Didn't you tell me you have this capsule that will carry humans all the way to Mars? It can't land anywhere but in the oceans of the Earth. It cannot land on the moon. It cannot land on Mars. Everything you've been told about NASA's Mars program is horsepucky. All of it. So we have to take an instrument that NASA has invented, an instrument that Bruce Pittman has given me most of my schooling on most of this, called the Space Act Agreement. In the old days, we bought programs from private industry in the military model, a cost-plus model. If I give you a $100 billion contract, I guarantee you that you will get 5% profit over and above the cost of the project. Well, I've just given you, if I've given you a cost-plus contract, I've given you a very good reason to double the cost to $200 billion, says that doubles your profit. And I've given you a very good reason to make sure that that project, which you might be able to otherwise finish in 6 months to 6 years, goes on for the next 16 years. Because as long as it goes on, I have a nipple in my mouth. And I can yank profits out of you. So we're talking about the Space Act agreements. You get everybody who wants to compete for a Mars program to come to you with a Mars program. You pick 2 or 3 of the finalists for the Mars program. You don't pay anybody a cent until they reach practical milestones. If they accomplish those milestones, they get money. You pay for delivery only. So what are we asking you to apply these Space Act agreements to instead of the traditional cost-plus agreements? To a Mars program. Elon Musk is in the lead with a Mars program. He's the person most likely to get us to Mars because his vehicles are not only reusable, thus costing today $63 to $62 million to launch, not $2 billion, but he's planning a vehicle that can land and be refueled on the Martian surface and then be sent back to Earth. All elements that are missing from NASA's Mars program. But we try to get as many other people as possible to compete and set out a bunch of milestones and pay these people only for their milestones. How do we get to the moon? We do a COTS-style competition, a Space Act Agreement competition. We ask everybody, just like the Lunar X Prize that was described a few minutes ago did. Let all the competitors come, pick the 2 and 3 best competitors, and then pay them for reaching specific milestones on the way to the moon. Is there anybody who has a practical moon program in the works? Well, there's a guy named Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos, who has a new rocket engine and a reusable rocket that he's flown, landed, and landed again 5 times. Jeff Bezos is talking about Amazon-like deliveries on a regular basis to the moon, specifically to the South Pole. Dennis is not happy, Dennis Wingo, about the South Pole, but that seems to be Jeff Bezos' goal. So take our entire manned space program, Space Act agreement buy it from private industry with a contract that guarantees or that emphasizes delivery, swiftness, and safety. Get NASA out of the rocket business, take the $3 billion a year, put it into a moon program, a Mars program, and an asteroid program, all done with Space Act agreements. And build a permanent highway in space. Build a permanent transport infrastructure in the sky above our heads. Do things that no one else is doing that only NASA can do. Things that we forgot about Bob Bigelow with the moon. He's got an entire lunar base ready to land on the moon. An entire permanent lunar base. So going to the moon with Bigelow and with SpaceX or Jeff Bezos, we don't just go to plant flags and footprints, we go to stay. The other elements that only NASA can do, right now, nobody's done fuel depots. Boeing has had plans for fuel depots for a long time. United Launch Alliance, which is partially owned by Boeing, has plans for space stations, gas stations in space, but they haven't been implemented in hardware yet. Pay somebody to make practical gas stations in the sky. No superhighway is a superhighway if you can't get gas when you run out of it. Secondly, ISRU units. People at NASA have developed all kinds of brilliant ideas for the machines that will take the ice that's in the craters, the permanently shadowed craters of the moon, and turn it into breathable oxygen, drinkable water, and rocket fuel. But nobody's built these pieces of equipment yet, much less scaled them down so that they're easy to transport. Nobody else is going to do that. NASA has to do that. So NASA has to pay for ISRU units. It has to pay for robotic mining devices. It has to pay for ground vehicles. And it can get all of that money from that $3 billion a year it saves by getting out of the rocket business, saying no to the SLS, throwing the Orion aside, and one other thing that NASA has to do It has to do its best to get the senators and congressmen in Washington, D.C. out of the engineering business. It is they who have designed the rockets that are too expensive to fly and can't possibly get us anywhere. That's it. Reinvent NASA. Go for delivery. Use Musk, Bezos, Bigelow, and whoever else wants to get into this race. Thank you very much.